Yo, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So we are now a week away from the trade deadline. It is on March 8th, and some deals have gone down in the last couple of days. Chris Tanev to Dallas 2 days ago. Ilya Lyubushkin to the Toronto Maple Leafs last night. So I thought I would hop on here before some other big names get traded and kind of predict what I think these guys will get in return, what the teams trading them will get in a package coming the other way in terms of it's going to be mainly picks and prospects for the most part. So I got 16 guys ready to go. Will all these guys get traded? Of course not. It'll probably only be like 9 or 10, especially some of the high end guys might not end up getting traded. But let's talk about what I think the packages will be based on previous examples and based off what I think they're worth, how many years left they have on their contract. All those things are being considered. So without further ado, let's get into it. And up first, we have Noah Hanifin. Hanifin is obviously probably the premier defender that is most likely to get traded. Jacob Chychrun, we're going to get to him. But it looks like at this point, Noah Hanifin is almost a lock to get traded. And I think when looking at Noah Hanifin, definitely the number one comparison that comes to mind recently is the Hampus Lindholm deal from 2 years ago when he got a first-round pick in 2 seconds. I think that Lindholm probably did have more value than a Hanifin. Hanifin's having a bit of a down year, in part because the Calgary Flames are just not as good as they were in prior years. So when looking at a Noah Hanifin, I would say a first and a second-round pick would be pretty solid, especially if a team is willing to sign him immediately on an extension, then maybe even a first, the second, and a third, or maybe 2 seconds. But I think for a rental, a high-end rental that can play top pair minutes for the most part, probably will be on a second pair on an actual contender. I think a guy like Noah Hanifin is definitely worth the first and probably a second on top of that, considering he is the main expiring unrestricted free agent defenseman at this point on the market. Next up, Matt Dumba. Matt Dumba, controversial guy. I think that he should only go for like a third-round pick, similar to an Ilya Lyubushkin, but I can easily see someone trading a second-round pick for him. There's reports that they want a first-round pick, but I think some team will bite for that more so physical defenseman come playoff time, like a Matt Dumba, and trade a second-round pick. I don't think it would be a good deal. If someone gives up a first-round pick, that would be a straight D minus kind of deal. A second round pick wouldn't be the end of the world, but I think he's definitely more so worth the third round pick. But I think someone's going to bite on this. Some general manager is going to want to add grit to their team and bring in Matt Dumba. Next up, Jake Guentzel. 2 first-round picks or like a first and an elite prospect, and arguably like top 50 prospect in the entire NHL. Players like this just don't become available at deadlines most of the time. Probably the best player since him, best forward, is a Claude Giroux, who went for a first, which is upcoming this year, a third, and Owen Tippett, who is a former top 10 pick, still like 21 or 22 years old, obviously broke out. So I think something similar to that, whether it is 2 first-round picks or a first and a 20-year-old, 21-year-old that doesn't have a ton of NHL games under their belt, but has a shit ton of promise and can be an impact player for the Penguins in the next year or two. I think that makes sense. Guentzel, when you acquire him, you're acquiring basically a 40-40 guy. He's been that for the most part for the past 3 or 4 seasons, and he immediately elevates your team on the whole. A lot of these other guys help your depth for the most part. Jake Guentzel is an immediate impact guy, probably your second or third. I can't even think what teams you'd be like the 4th best forward on. Second or third best forward if you're a playoff team. Jake Guentzel, go all in. Only a handful of teams I could see realistically doing this. This would be a very high price to pay. You need to be locked up in a top 2 division spot to have the balls to do this kind of deal. But I think definitely the equivalent of 2 first-round picks is what Kyle Dubas is rightfully so going to want for Jake Guentzel. Next up, Sean Walker. Don't think he ends up getting a first-round pick similar to a Matt Dumba, but I do think he is a better player than Matt Dumba, so I think he's going to get a second and a third-round pick. Right now, Sean Walker can be a solid second-pair guy on a potential playoff team, maybe on a real contender. He'd be more so of a third-pair guy, but he would be a very good third-pair guy, playing fantastic on the Philadelphia Flyers. Had some solid seasons in LA, but this is definitely his best year, and if you're the Philadelphia Flyers, you're probably trading him at this point. They've gone through extension talks. He wants a, $4 or $5 million. The Flyers, I think almost like $5 million at this point. Flyers don't want to do that, rightfully so. Trade his ass. Second and third would be solid compensation for that, considering they do have a lot of picks going forward. I think Sean Walker ends up getting traded for around the second and a third pick. Jordan Eberle, first round pick on the dot. Not that high of a cap hit. I believe it's $5 million, 5 or 5.5, so around 2.5 or 2.75 after half retention. This year, 35 points in 55 games. Very strong offensive play driving numbers. And I think he can be a good second line right winger on basically any playoff team right now. In his playoffs, the last 4 playoff runs that he's had, he has 45 points in 63 games. Yes, he had 2 points in his first playoff run with the Edmonton Oilers back in 2017, which kind of led to them eventually trading him. But since then, he's been pretty money in the playoffs last year. Last year, very good for the Seattle Kraken. And again, good underlying numbers. I think a team like the New York Rangers make a lot of sense. He would probably be their first line right winger to play with Kreider and Zibanejad. I think Jordan Eberle, given his veteran presence and just overall skill, is worth the first round pick at this year's deadline, assuming the Seattle Kraken retain 50%. UC Saros, same thing as Jake Guentzel, and maybe even more, the equivalent of 2 first-round picks. When looking at Saros, playing much better of late in his last 5 games, he's 5-0. He has like a .950 save percentage, looking like his old self, as well as the fact that he has another year at $5 million. Jake Guentzel, he's either going to walk or you're going to have to give him this massive 8-year, $9.5 million extension. Saros has another year at $5 million, very reasonable. So if you can get him, if you're the New Jersey Devils, I would be more than willing. I made a hypothetical on this, but I would be more than willing to trade a first-round pick and an Alexander Holtz, who is a solid young player. He's only 22 years old, on pace for like 35, 40 points. He's easily worth a mid-first-round pick. I would easily be willing to ship that to get your goalie this year to potentially make the playoffs, and next year have definitely a top 10 goalie, in my opinion, for $5 million next year. He might be the most valuable player. I'm very high on UC Saros. I think he is probably the most valuable player on the market right now, considering so many teams do need goaltending. I would give up an arm and a leg, the equivalent of around 2 first-round picks, and then maybe another third on top of that. I think UC Saros is definitely worth that much. Adam Henrique, a first and a fourth. He's proving to be a very good second-line center on a playoff team. I think at this point would be one of the best third-line centers if you have that much center depth. 41 points in 58 games right now, so he is displaying a lot of offense. And 2 years ago, he also had 42 points in 58 games, which is around 58-point pace. You throw him in that second-line center role. I think a team like the Colorado Avalanche make a lot of sense, and the price should be a first-round pick. He has a $5.75 million cap hit, so you get him at just under $3 million on the books, half retained. I think the Ducks would, of course, be willing to half retain. They're retained on goddamn Lyubushkin. So I think Adam Henrique is definitely going to be a first-round pick type of guy, considering he has that veteran presence and has been showing his ability to generate some offense of late. So a first and a fourth makes sense. Pavel Buchnevich, again, back to Jake Guentzel and UC Saros. I think he's worth 2 first-round picks. I think he's probably more valuable than Jake Guentzel because similarly to Saros, it's not just this year. He has another year at $5.8 million. This guy, the last 3 years on the St. Louis Blues, has 190 points in 191 games. He has been fantastic for the Blues in his tenure. A little bit of a down year this year, but his down year is still like 70-point pace, solid defensively. So if a team is going out and trading for a guy that's going to be at a very reasonable okay second liner money the next year and a half, I assume the Blues aren't going to retain anything over 20% on this deal, considering they're trying to be competitive and he does have another year left. But if you can somehow, if you have LTIR money and you can get a Pavel Buchnevich for a first and an elite prospect, if you're a win now team that doesn't really want to wait on a guy, I think that makes that makes a ton of sense to go in and get a Pavel Buchnevich. Jake Allen, honestly, just like a third round pick. His contract's bad at this point. He might be a net negative player. 3rd, 4th round pick for Jake Allen, which at the start of the season, Canadiens fans expected maybe a second and a third. When looking at Allen, .892 save percentage, $3.85 million cap hit next year as well. So maybe if you're a team that has a bunch of cap space from LTIR or whatever, you take a chance. Maybe he can be a solid veteran down the stretch and help you out come playoff time. But I can't, if someone gives up a second, God forbid, no one's giving up a first, but like even a second round pick, I think would be a massive overpayment for a guy that is making low end starter money next year as well to put up a goddamn 892. I don't like that one bit. Tarasenko, first round pick, assuming he's half retained, similarly on the same level as like a Sean Monahan. Obviously, Tarasenko last year got a first round pick and a 3rd round pick from the New York Rangers. Last year, he was making $7.5 million, so half retained was only 3.75. This year, only making 5, so half retained 2.5. His production has gone down a little bit. 38 points in 55 games, which is around 0.7 points per game. Last year, 29 and 38, which is around 0.76. So he's still producing at a high rate, but even with the dip of production, you're going to get him for much cheaper, even at half retained. So when looking at it, I think a team that needs top 6 wingers, a first round pick does make sense for Vladimir Tarasenko. Obviously, he has performed in the playoffs, veteran guy in the locker room. I think a first round pick, if he's not retained, if he's $5 million, maybe just a second round pick. But I think the Senators would be smart to retain money. Their season's kind of cooked, especially with Josh Norris going on LTIR. Jacob Markstrom. I'm just going to go with 1 first round pick. maybe, I don't even know if I'd pay that, to be honest. When looking at it, Markstrom, if he only had 1 year left at $6 million, I think it would be a first round pick, maybe even more. But the fact that there is 2 years left on this contract and he's like the 6th or 7th highest paid goalie in the entire NHL, it's risky. The dude is so inconsistent over seasons. 2 years ago, Vezina finalist. Last year, bottom 5 starting goalie in the entire NHL. This year, again, top 10 goalie, maybe top 5 in the entire NHL. It is very risky if you are a team trading for him. I assume the Calgary Flames aren't going to be retaining money on this, considering it is a pretty high cap hit with 2 years left. It's risky. I think a first round pick would get it done. I think that's what you would probably have to pay. I think that's what they would get, but definitely not nearly as much as a UC Soros, who has term left, is younger, more consistent year over year. Jacob Markstrom, I don't think he's going to get traded this year just because of that cap hit, maybe in the summer, maybe next year when there's only a year and a half left, but it's definitely something to monitor. Jacob Chychrun, I'm going to go with a second round pick. And like a B prospect, like an okay former 2021 second or third round pick. When looking at Chychrun, he was traded last deadline for a first in 2 seconds. I think you would get a little bit less value first, second, and then just like an okay prospect instead of that other second, because now he obviously, instead of 2.5 years at a very good $4.6 million, now it's just a year and a half at $4.6 million. Still a very good player. Not the best fit in Ottawa, considering they have a shit ton of left-handed defensemen. So when looking at Chychrun, I think a team that needs a second pair guy, maybe even a first guy that could potentially play first pair of minutes, I think Chychrun would be a great fit. You would have to give up a lot, considering $4.6 million for a guy like that. I look at Hanifin first and a second. I would rather have Chychrun for the next 2 years for a first, a second, and around the second and third equivalent prospect. I think that's around the price for a Jacob Chychrun. Anthony Duclair, just a third round pick. Solid option. You can maybe bet on his past, think that he's going to rebound after getting out of the San Jose Sharks. 22 points in 53 games. The problem is he's not on like a $2 million or like a $1.5 million contract. It is $3 million. So even at half retained, not a fat cap hit, but the $1.5 million. So I think he could potentially be a guy that if someone strikes out on a top tier winger, they try to bring in a Duclair. Maybe you can find that spark again with Duclair, but he's not going to get that much considering post Achilles tear. He hasn't really been the same player in that cap hit at $3 million. Alex Wenberg, I'm going to go second round pick. And like a B prospect, nothing really too much. I don't think that he would get a first round pick because although he's been very solid defensively for the Seattle Kraken since he got there, not a ton of offense, 25 points in 59 games. Basically just a solid he would be a solid shutdown third line center, which teams definitely need, but I don't think you pay a first round pick for that. I think you pay a second round pick in a 2020 or 2021 draft pick that maybe can turn into an okay NHLer one day, but not a high-end guy. So when looking at it, I think teams do need third-line centers. I think the Rangers are actually a pretty good fit for an Alex Wenberg type with Filipino obviously out. So a second and a B prospect, that's probably the equivalent of like a third or fourth round pick. Vetrano, I'm going to go a first, a third, and a fourth round pick for Vetrano. I wouldn't go quite... You could definitely, considering if there's no retention, I think a first, a third, and a fourth. He is balling out this year, has another year left at $3.65 million, playing fantastic, 27 goals in 59 games, could be a top 6 guy on basically any team in the league. New York Rangers, I hate to keep on bringing them up, but a reunion there would be insane. When looking at Vetrano, yeah, that extra year really adds a decent amount on top of it. Honestly, I could see a first and a second for a guy like Vetrano just because of that extra year, but it's going to be very interesting. I don't think he's going to end up getting traded, but I think that would be around the pick. If they retain 20%, then I think it would, if you get him at like a $2.8 million cap hit, I think it would definitely be a first and a second round pick. Vetrano's a very good player. And then lastly, Scott Laughton. Flyers are apparently asking for a first round pick for him. I'm going to go with the second and a third. He is that greasy 40-ish point pace guy. He has 30 points in 60 games this year that GMs tend to like. Middle sixer that can kind of play in all situations. His advanced analytics have kind of absolutely tanked this year. He's in like the bottom 10% in WAR, but I still think a second and a third round pick, I could see a team paying that. They don't want to give up a first round pick for one of these rental guys. They go out and get a Scott Laughton who still has 2 years left at this at a reasonable $3 million. I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's the video. Hanifin, first and a second round pick. Dumba should get a third, but probably will get a second. Guentzel, the equivalency of 2 firsts, whether that's a first and a good prospect or a first and 2, or just 2 firsts. Sean Walker, second and a third. Jordan Eberle, a first round pick. Soros, 2 firsts equivalent. Henrique, a first and a fourth. Buchnevich, 2 first rounds equivalent. Jake Allen, a third round pick. Tarasenko, a first. Markstrom, a first. Chychrun, a first, a second, and maybe a little bit more on top of that. Duclair, a third. Wenberg, a second and an okay prospect. Vetrano, a first, a third, and a fourth. If they retain, probably bump that up to a second round pick. And then Scott Laughton, a second and a third. Let me know in the comments, what do you think? Again, you might think that this is a little bit of high prices, but I do think it is a seller's market based on what we saw. And who do you think is going to end up getting traded? And what do you think those packages will be? And I'll be seeing you in the next one.